The scissors glinted under the glasshouse lights, cold in the manicured hand of Clarissa Hawthorne Merrill. "Hold her still," she ordered, her voice sweet as sugar and sharp as broken glass. 2 house staff stood on either side of Nadia Voskin, reluctantly resting their hands on her shoulders. But she didn't bother to struggle, because she'd learned long ago that the weak only hurt more when they fight back. Clarissa, 29, with her perfect platinum blonde hair and the smile that once graced the covers of beauty magazines, circled the Maid the way a predator circles its prey. She lifted a long chestnut curl of Nadia's hair, the hair her mother once washed with rosemary water in a cramped old sewing workshop, the only inheritance left from a woman now gone. "You think you're something special?" Clarissa whispered into her ear. "You think because you've been here 7 years, because he remembers your name, you actually matter?" Nadia, 27, with a faint scar on her left wrist and the eyes of someone who'd survived fire, didn't say a word. She just looked down at the white orchids and thought of her sister waiting for her at home. The blades closed. The sound came before she could even feel it, and then her hair fell to the tile among the flowers, strand by strand, like the ashes of something that could never be taken back. Clarissa held up the severed length and dropped it at her feet like a fistful of garbage. "Now let's see how special you really are." What Clarissa didn't know, what no one in that lavish mansion could have imagined, was that the most powerful man on the East Coast had walked through the stone gates just minutes before. Dragan Kovac, 34, with eyes gray as cooled steel and hands marked by scars that told their own stories. A man whose name the whole city spoke only in whispers, and he lived by one single rule that no one had ever broken and walked away whole from. Never, ever touch the powerless. 4 months earlier, Nadia still believed that if she bowed her head low enough, no one would ever see her. She was wrong, because someone had seen everything. If this story of courage and dignity touched your heart, hit that like button so we know you're listening. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that they deserve to be respected. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story that matters. 4 months. That was how long Clarissa Hawthorne Merrill had been inside the mansion and begun changing everything. But for Nadia Voskin, this place had already been an entire lifetime. 7 years. 7 winters in which she had silently wiped the glass windows that looked out over Long Island Sound. 7 summers in which she had polished every piece of silver in the dining room so vast that even footsteps echoed. 7 years in which she had learned how to become invisible among people who had never truly seen her. She woke before daylight, when the dew still clung to the perfectly trimmed lawn, and she worked in a silence that had become instinct. People didn't hire a maid because they wanted to hear her speak. They hired her so everything would be clean, orderly, and so she would disappear the moment the work was done. Nadia had understood that for a long time, and she had turned endurance into a kind of art. But there was one reason she endured it all. A reason named Mila, her 20-year-old younger sister, who couldn't hear the sounds of life but had the brightest eyes Nadia had ever known, was studying baking at a small shop a few miles away. Every morning, before leaving the cramped apartment the 2 sisters rented together, Nadia would place a hand on Mila's shoulder and sign that she would be home before dark, and Mila would smile, her hands moving quickly through the dough, as if her whole world were held inside those pastries scented with butter. Nadia worked not for the meager wages, but because every dollar was a brick laid along the road toward a future for Mila that Nadia herself had never dared to dream of. On Nadia's left wrist was a faint scar, as long as a finger joint, and whenever hot water touched it, an old memory rose again like smoke. The smell of burning, the sound of people screaming, muffled behind doors, an emergency exit that should have opened but refused to move. Nadia never told anyone about that night, about the garment workshop where her mother had worked until her final breath, about the guilt that had followed her for 10 years like a shadow that never left. She had survived, and her mother had not, and sometimes she wondered whether surviving was a gift or only a longer sentence. She buried that memory deep, so deep that she almost believed she had forgotten it, until it found its way back in the moments when her heart was at its weakest. The only person in the mansion who treated Nadia like a human being was Mr. Theodore Hawthorne, the owner of all these stone walls and gardens. Theodore was a quiet man, heir to an enormous fortune, yet he carried within him a rare kindness for someone who had never had to struggle. 3 years earlier, when he learned that Mila needed cochlear implant surgery and that the cost was far beyond anything Nadia could manage, he personally paid for all of it, without claiming credit, without attaching a single condition. He only said that a child deserved to hear the sound of her own laughter, and then he placed the expense into the household care budget as if it were the most natural thing in the world. To Nadia, it wasn't money. It was the first sound Mila had ever heard, the moment her little sister burst into tears when she heard Nadia's voice, the fragile thread connecting her to hope. And precisely because that thread was so precious, Nadia was willing to bow her head before anything to keep it from breaking. She didn't know that 4 months later, someone would place a hand on that thread and tighten it until it nearly stopped breathing. That thread began to pull tight on a late autumn morning, when Theodore gathered the entire household staff in the main hall and announced in a voice overflowing with happiness that he was engaged. The woman who stepped out from behind him was so beautiful that the whole room seemed to hold its breath, her platinum blonde hair falling as if it had been sculpted, her skin flawless, and her radiant smile belonging to someone used to being looked at. Theodore introduced her as Clarissa, a successful businesswoman in the cosmetics industry, the founder of a brand with a name that sounded strangely gentle, Kind Beauty, with millions of followers online and countless interviews praising her as a symbol of elegance and compassion. Nadia stood tucked away at the end of the line, her hands folded in front of her apron, and when Clarissa's eyes moved across each face among the servants, she felt a chill run down her spine without understanding why. That smile was too perfect, too steady, like a painting made to hide something behind the layer of color. When Clarissa's gaze stopped on her for one brief moment, Nadia realized it wasn't warm like the smile at all, but cold and sharp, like someone assessing an object before deciding whether to keep it or throw it away. That unease had no words, only a shape, and Nadia had learned long ago that silent instincts were often the truest ones. Only a few days later, Clarissa began leaving her mark on the mansion like a knife, carving a name into the trunk of a tree. That afternoon, as Nadia was preparing the antique porcelain tea set the Hawthorne family had preserved through 3 generations, a delicate set with indigo blue patterns that had once poured tea for senators and scholars alike, Clarissa entered the drawing room and stopped as if she had just caught an unpleasant smell. She picked up a cup, turned it lightly in her hand, and examined it beneath the light with the expression of someone enduring something distasteful. "This thing," she said, her voice still sweet, though each word fell like a drop of acid, "looks like something people would sell at a flea market." Nadia softly explained that it was a family heirloom, Mr. Theodore treasured deeply, that it was more than 100 years old, but Clarissa cut her off with a light laugh, as if taking pity on her. "Age doesn't make something refined, dear girl," she said. "It only makes it old. Put it away, or better yet, get rid of it somewhere, and replace it with something worthy of this house from now on." In that moment, Nadia understood that this wasn't just about a tea set. It was a carefully delivered message, that everything belonging to the past of this house, even the people who had been bound to it, could be replaced with a single weightless sentence. She held the tea set against her chest, as if holding something alive, and when she turned away, she caught the eyes of Mr. Faith, Oswald, the old butler who had served the Hawthorne family for nearly 40 years. Oswald was 68 years old, his back slightly bent, but his eyes still strangely keen, and in that moment he was standing silently by the doorway, saying nothing, only watching Clarissa with an unreadable thoughtfulness. He didn't object, didn't comment, only gave Nadia a small nod like a wordless comfort, then turned and continued with his work. But Nadia had worked beside that man long enough to understand that his silence wasn't indifference. It was the silence of someone who had seen too much, someone who knew there were storms that couldn't be stopped with words, only remembered, detail by detail, until the day the truth needed to be told. That evening, when Nadia put the antique tea set deep at the bottom of the storage cabinet, she didn't know she had just witnessed the first move in a game she didn't yet know she had already become a pawn in. Before that game could even take clear shape, another figure stepped into the mansion, a man no one among the servants dared to name aloud. It was a midweek evening, when Theodore was hosting a private dinner he called a business matter, and the entire house had been instructed to prepare everything with care down to the smallest detail. Nadia overheard from Mr. Oswald that tonight's guest was the man who had once saved the entire Hawthorne family from a disaster that ordinary money couldn't solve. A few years earlier, the family's port investment division had fallen into the hands of a group of extortionists, men who threatened to burn every contract to the ground and destroy the family's reputation if they didn't receive what they wanted. Theodore, with all his wealth and his expensive lawyers, had still been helpless, until one man appeared and made the problem disappear after a single conversation. That man was Dragan Kovac, and from then on, Theodore carried a debt of gratitude he knew money could never repay. When the polished black car rolled through the stone gates at dusk, the whole house seemed to sink down by one quiet beat. Dragan stepped out, tall and composed, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his gray eyes cold as cooled metal sweeping once across the hall, taking in everything while revealing nothing. Behind him came a silent bodyguard, and the air around the two men carried such weight that even Clarissa, for the first time since arriving here, lowered her voice by a shade. Nadia was assigned to serve during dinner, and she worked with her usual carefulness, moving quietly among powerful people like a weightless shadow. But that night, perhaps because of the tension, or perhaps because the guest's sharp, cold gaze unsettled her, as she carried the tray of wine across the room, the toe of her shoe caught on the edge of the rug, and the tray tilted. A glass slipped from the tray, fell, and shattered across the marble floor, the crisp sound of breaking glass ringing through the silent room like an accusation. In that moment, the blood inside Nadia seemed to turn cold. She bent down quickly, her trembling hands hurrying to gather the shards of glass, her head lowered, waiting for a shout, an insult, something she had grown far too used to. But what left her frozen wasn't punishment. It was another hand bending down beside her, a large hand with old scars running across the knuckles, gently picking up a shard of glass and placing it on the tray to help her. Nadia looked up, and for one brief instant, she met Dragan Kovac's gray eyes looking straight into hers. There was no pity in that gaze, and no contempt either, only something difficult to name, as if he were seeing something others did not see, or remembering something he had tried to forget. The moment lasted only a breath, then he stood, said nothing to her, and returned to the dinner table as though nothing had happened. Nadia withdrew from the room, with her heart beating wildly, unable to understand why such a small gesture had moved her so deeply. It had been far too long since anyone in this house had bent down to her level. After dinner, as Dragan was being seen to his car, the bodyguard quietly said something about one of the servants having caused a clumsy incident, and Dragan stopped beside the car door, his eyes turning toward the lit windows of the mansion. "There are people who trample the weak because they think they have no one to protect them," he said quietly, his voice low and cold. "But I never forget people who do that." The bodyguard didn't fully understand the meaning of those words, and he didn't dare ask. The car rolled away into the night, leaving behind a house that would soon become the place where the very rule he had just spoken of would be tested. That trial began only a few days after the mysterious guest left, when Clarissa decided it was time to draw the boundaries of power inside this house. One morning, while Nadia was cleaning the hallway that led to Theodore's study, the place where she had dusted the bookshelves and polished the walnut desk for 7 long years, Clarissa appeared and blocked the doorway with her arms folded. "Starting today, you're not allowed to set foot in this room anymore," she said, her voice flat but cold as stone. Nadia softly explained that it was part of her work, that Mr. Theodore had always wanted the room kept clean, but Clarissa tilted her head and looked at her with a thin smile, as if she were looking at a child who had dared to talk back. "I didn't ask for your opinion," she said. "When I say you're not allowed in, it means you're not allowed in, and the next time you open your mouth to contradict me, you'll learn that in this house, there are people who are allowed to speak, and people who are only allowed to stay silent." Nadia lowered her head, swallowed the bitter lump in her throat, and stepped back. She was used to insults, but there was something in the way Clarissa spoke that made her understand this wasn't a passing impulse, but a calculated strategy, a way of tightening the cord little by little around the necks of those she considered threats. A few days later, the humiliation reached the deepest place in Nadia's heart. That afternoon, Mila stopped by the mansion to bring her sister a small box of pastries she had just made as a trial at the bakery, and the two sisters stood speaking to each other in sign language, in the side passage near the kitchen, their hands moving through the air, their faces bright with a rare joy. Clarissa passed by, stopped to watch them for a moment with curiosity mixed with contempt, then dropped a sentence that left them both frozen. "What a strange sight," she said. "The two of you sisters, one who can't speak, and one who really shouldn't speak. Perhaps both of you should learn how to keep quiet according to your place." Nadia felt as if someone had slapped her across the face, not because Clarissa had aimed at her, but because she had dared to touch Mila, dared to turn the most sacred thing between the two sisters into a cheap joke. Nadia's hand clenched, her nails biting into her palm, and for one moment she almost wanted to answer back. But then she thought of Mila's ears, of the fragile sound her sister had fought to regain, and she swallowed her anger as if swallowing a burning coal, because Nadia knew a truth Clarissa understood far too well. The entire cost of Mila's treatment and her regular cochlear implant follow-up visits was listed under the Hawthorne household care budget, and ever since arriving here, Clarissa had cleverly taken control of every household expense, from groceries to the servants' wages. The thread connecting Mila to Hope now lay neatly inside the carefully groomed hand of this woman, and Clarissa understood that perfectly. Every word Nadia spoke, every time she dared to raise her head, could become an excuse for that thread to be cut. That evening, as Nadia passed the half-closed study, she accidentally heard Theodore's voice coming from inside during a phone call, and the words he spoke made her stop short. "I owe Dragan Kovac a debt of gratitude I can't repay in this lifetime," he said to the person on the other end of the line. "Without him, this family would have had nothing left to preserve." Nadia hurried past, her heart full of confusion, not understanding why those words had engraved themselves so deeply into her memory, not knowing that one day, the name Dragan Kovac and that debt of gratitude would become the only thing standing between her and the abyss. That abyss did not come in one single fall, but step by step, through humiliations Clarissa carried out so skillfully that they always seemed like accidents. One afternoon, when Nadia was called up to Clarissa's enormous dressing room to rearrange shelves of cosmetics piled as high as a mountain, Clarissa was testing a new dye product line for her brand. Nadia worked quietly in the corner of the room, while Clarissa spoke on the phone with a business partner and held a bottle of dark dye in her hand. When Nadia walked past to place a stack of towels on a shelf, Clarissa, with a movement that no one could later prove was deliberate, tilted her wrist and let the stream of dye pour straight down the front of Nadia's white uniform, spreading into a filthy black stain. "My God," Clarissa cried, her voice filled with a false irritation. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Are you so clumsy that you can't even cross a room without ruining something?" Nadia stood frozen, looking down at the uniform now blotched and ruined, knowing perfectly well that Clarissa had done it herself, but she couldn't say a word. Clarissa went on, her voice rising by degrees, scolding her for being careless, for being unworthy of serving in a house of such standing, saying that anywhere else she would have been fired long ago. Nadia lowered her head and apologized, though in her heart each word of apology felt like a knife she was turning against herself, and she withdrew with the uniform soaked in dye she knew would never wash clean, just like the way those insults would cling to her mind. But that was not the worst of it. A few days later, one morning while Theodore was having breakfast in the dining room, Clarissa entered with a face full of distress, holding in her hands the broken pieces of the antique teapot from the very set she had once ordered Nadia to put away. "Theodore," she said, her voice choked as if she were about to cry. "I don't want to say this, but I just caught your maid breaking the family heirloom tea set, the very set you've always treasured." Theodore looked up, a flash of pain passing through his eyes, then turned toward Nadia, who was standing nearby to serve. Nadia felt as if the ground had collapsed beneath her feet. She knew exactly where that tea set had been stored, knew that she herself had wrapped it carefully and placed it deep at the bottom of the storage cabinet, and that there was only one person who had both the authority and the reason to take it out and smash it. But when she opened her mouth to defend herself, Clarissa looked at Theodore with tear-filled eyes and a wounded expression, and Nadia saw the thing she feared most appear on her kind employer's face. Theodore believed his wife. He sighed, set down his knife and fork, and said in a tired voice that he had not thought Nadia would be so careless, that perhaps she should be more careful from now on. He did not shout, did not punish her, but that very gentleness mixed with disappointment hurt Nadia more than any words could have, because it showed her that the only person who had once looked at her as a human being was now beginning to see her through the lens Clarissa had built. She lowered her head and accepted blame for something she had not done, then left the room with a heavy heart. What Nadia did not know was that in the shadowed corner on the other side of the room, Mr. Oswald had witnessed everything. That night, in his small room, the old butler took out an old leather-covered notebook, turned on the desk lamp, and with the neat handwriting of a man who had worked carefully his whole life, he began recording each incident, each date, each spoken word, quietly and patiently. He did not know what these pages would be used for, or whether the day would ever come when they would be needed, but he was certain of one thing, that the truth had to be preserved somewhere, so when that day came, it would not be buried beneath lies. And that day might not be far off, because in only a few weeks, Theodore's mother, the most powerful woman in the Hawthorne family, would come to visit. Before Theodore's mother could set foot in the mansion, Someone else returned to the house, and this time his presence would record something no one expected. Dragan Kovac came back late one afternoon to discuss the final terms related to the port division, a meeting Theodore had been waiting for over many weeks. He was shown into the study with his silent bodyguard, and while Theodore went to fetch several files from the adjoining room, Dragan stood alone beside the large window, quietly watching the garden sink into the shadow of dusk. It was at that very moment, through the half-open door leading to the hallway, that he heard a voice. It was Clarissa's voice, sharp and cold, drifting from the end of the hall, where she was pouring her fury onto one of the servants. Dragan could not see the entire scene, but he heard every word clearly, humiliating words wrapped in a sweetness so eerie it chilled the blood, scolding a woman for imaginary mistakes, lowering her until she seemed worth less than an object. And through the crack in the door, he caught a brief glimpse of the familiar figure of the girl who had dropped the glass at the previous dinner, the girl with the eyes of someone who had once walked through fire, standing with her head bowed as she silently endured it, not offering a single word in her own defense, her thin shoulders trembling beneath the weight of those words. Something in that scene made Dragan stand motionless, his scarred hand tightening slightly at his side. He was a man who had witnessed too much cruelty in his life, had faced the most dangerous people without blinking, but the sight of someone powerful, trampling someone weaker, who had nothing with which to defend herself, always awakened in him something primitive, a coldness running along his spine that he had carried for many years. In that moment, the image of the girl standing with her head bowed in the hallway overlapped with another image, faint and distant, the shadow of a woman he had once known, someone he had once promised to protect, but had failed to save in time. He did not allow himself to think too deeply about that memory, because it was a wound he had buried too carefully, but the mere fact that it had risen again was enough to make his jaw tighten. Every instinct in him urged him to step into the hallway, place a hand on that girl's shoulder, and end everything with a single sentence. But Dragan Kovac was not a man who acted on instinct. He lived by his own rules, and one of those rules was that he never interfered in another man's household without a rightful reason, never crossed a boundary before its time. This was Theodore's house, and that girl was Theodore's servant, and though anger was boiling inside him, he forced himself to remain still, quietly observing, quietly waiting. When Theodore returned with the files, Dragan's face had already settled back into its familiar calm, with no trace of the storm that had just passed through him, and they continued discussing business as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, and the only person who noticed it was the bodyguard who always stood beside him. When they left the mansion, after both men had gotten into the car and the stone gate had closed behind them, the bodyguard glanced at his employer through the rearview mirror and noticed that Dragan's gray eyes were staring into the darkness with a cold focus he rarely saw. "That woman earlier," Dragan said quietly, his voice so low it was almost only a breath, the servant who was being scolded in the hallway. The bodyguard nodded and waited. "Remember that face," Dragan continued, "and remember the face of the one who scolded her." The bodyguard did not ask why, because he had followed this man long enough to know that some things were better left unquestioned. But he also understood that those words carried an unusual weight, as if they had been spoken not from passing displeasure, but from somewhere far deeper, from an old wound his employer had never told anyone about. The car rolled into the night, and behind those lit windows, no one knew that a name and a face had just been carved into the memory of the most powerful man on the East Coast, and that one day, that invisible debt would have to be paid. That invisible debt still lay hidden in the dark as the mansion entered its most tense days, because Theodore's mother's visit was drawing very near. Eleanor Hawthorne was the most powerful woman in the family, a woman over 70, who still kept the sharp eyes of someone who could see through every falsehood, and Clarissa understood that the first impression she made on her future mother-in-law would decide a great deal. All week, she threw herself into rearranging every detail of the house with an almost frantic intensity, forcing the servants to clean things that were already spotless again and again, replacing all the fresh flowers every day, and scrutinizing each member of the staff as if they were pieces on a chessboard. She was determined to win. In the midst of that obsession, Clarissa's gaze came to rest on Nadia, and more specifically, on her long, curly, chestnut-brown hair. One morning, she called Nadia into the drawing room and looked her over from head to toe with the expression of someone assessing a flaw that needed to be corrected. "Your hair," she said, her voice sweet but every word deliberate, "is too noticeable, too fussy, and not appropriate for someone in your position." When Theodore's mother arrives, I need everyone in this house to look polished and to know their place. And that thick hair of yours makes you look less like a servant and more like someone trying to attract attention. I've booked an appointment for you at the salon this afternoon. You'll go there and cut it neatly, shorter, properly suited to your position." Nadia stood still, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt something different rise inside her chest. Not fear, but a smoldering defiance she had thought she had lost long ago. That hair wasn't only hair. It was what her mother had once washed for her with rosemary water in the cramped garment workshop years before. The only thing left of a woman who had vanished into smoke and fire, the fragile thread tying Nadia to a past she never wanted to release. Cutting it off at Clarissa's command would not simply be changing a hairstyle. It would be surrendering the last part of herself that still belonged to her to the woman who had already taken almost everything from her. And this time, Nadia couldn't lower her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice soft but not trembling. "I've always tied my hair neatly while I work, and I'll continue to keep it tidy. But I would like to keep my hair." The room seemed to freeze. Clarissa blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Because in all her time here, this silent maid had never once dared to refuse her. The smile on her lips vanished, replaced by a coldness more frightening than any fit of rage. "What did you just say to me?" she asked, her voice dropping very low. Nadia clasped her hands tightly behind her back, her heart pounding, but she repeated, slowly and clearly, that she would do every task assigned to her, but she wouldn't cut her hair. For one long moment, Clarissa only stared at her, and in the woman's eyes, Nadia saw not ordinary anger, but a cold calculation, as if Clarissa had just realized that the pawn she had believed fully subdued still carried a small piece of will that needed to be broken. "Very well," she said softly, and the smile returned to her lips, a smile that chilled Nadia more than her shouting ever had. "If you don't want to go to the salon, that's perfectly fine." Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Nadia standing alone in the room with the instinct that she had just made a mistake she would have to pay for. That afternoon, when the sunlight had turned golden and slanted through the glass panes of the orchid greenhouse, Nadia was called there under the excuse of tidying the flower pots for the reception. She stepped inside among the delicate sweetness of white orchids, unaware that Clarissa was already waiting inside, and in the woman's carefully groomed hand, a pair of scissors was silently waiting for the light to catch it. When Clarissa and the 2 servants left the greenhouse, leaving behind the soft click of the glass door falling half closed and the sweet scent of orchids that still seemed to mock her, Nadia stood motionless in the middle of the room for a long while, as if she stayed still long enough, the moment that had just happened would dissolve like a nightmare. But it didn't dissolve. At her feet, on the tiled floor among the white orchid pots, lay scattered locks of chestnut brown hair, silent and lifeless, something that only a few hours earlier had still been part of her. Slowly, she knelt down, her trembling hands gathering each lock of hair, holding them in her palms with a tenderness so painful it nearly choked her, as if she were cradling the remains of something sacred. She didn't cry. The tears seemed to have frozen somewhere inside her chest, leaving behind only an immense emptiness, the feeling that what had been taken from her wasn't only her hair, but a piece of her soul. She took the broom and dustpan, swept up every strand still left on the floor, then wiped the tiles until the greenhouse looked whole again, as if nothing had ever happened, because that was what people always required of her, that she clean away even the traces of her own pain. When night fell and she dragged herself back to the small apartment the 2 sisters rented together, Nadia had wrapped a scarf around her head, trying to hide what remained of her hair, but she knew she couldn't hide it from Mila. The moment Nadia opened the door, her sister looked up from the table where she was kneading dough for the evening batch of pastries, and Mila's eyes stopped at once. She couldn't hear the heaviness in her sister's footsteps, but she read everything on Nadia's face, in the slump of her shoulders, in the clumsy scarf wrapped around her head. Mila stepped closer, her hands gently lifting the scarf, and when she saw Nadia's hair cut raggedly and unevenly, tears filled her eyes, not from fear, but from a sorrow so deep it twisted the heart. She didn't ask who had done this. She didn't need to ask, because she understood enough about the world her sister lived in to know the answer. Instead, Mila wrapped her arms tightly around her sister, pressing her cheek against Nadia's trembling shoulder, and inside that warm embrace, all the restraint Nadia had held for so long finally broke open into silent tears. The 2 sisters stood there in the cramped little kitchen without a single spoken word, with only the warmth of family saying everything for them. After a while, Mila stepped back, raised her hands, and signed to her sister in the language only the two of them truly understood. Gentle movements, telling her that hair would grow back, that Nadia was still beautiful, that no matter what happened, she would always be there. And Nadia, watching her little sister's small hands move through the air with wordless comfort, felt her heart shatter and mend at the same time. But that night, after Mila had fallen asleep, Nadia sat alone by the window overlooking the empty street, and something inside her began to crack. All her life, she had believed that if she bowed her head low enough, stayed silent long enough, endured enough, then she and the people she loved would be safe. That was the lesson she had learned at 17, the shield she had used to protect herself for all these years. But now, sitting in the dark with her hair taken from her, she began to wonder in confusion whether that shield meant anything anymore, whether her bowed head had truly protected anyone, or whether it had only invited more hands to come and take what remained. She still didn't know what to do. No decision had formed yet, only a vague crack and an unspoken question growing larger inside her. What Nadia didn't know was that the next morning, when she returned to the mansion with the scarf wrapped around her head, Mr. Oswald quietly watched her from a distance, and those old eyes understood everything at once. That night, beneath the glow of his desk lamp, the old butler opened the leather-covered notebook again, added one more line in his neat handwriting, then stopped, set down his pen, and softly whispered to himself that every storm had an end, and that one day everything hidden in the dark would be forced to step into the light. The day when the truth would be forced to step into the light had not yet arrived, but before that, Clarissa's darkness found one more victim, and this time it fell upon a girl still too young to understand why the world could be so cruel. Junie Prell was only 22, a design student at a nearby college who worked in the kitchen of the Hawthorne mansion a few days each week to help pay her tuition. Junie was a bright girl, quick to smile, always carrying with her a clear, innocent optimism that Nadia secretly admired, because it reminded her of herself many years ago, when she still believed that as long as a person worked hard and stayed kind, life would treat them fairly. But Clarissa did not care about anyone's youth or innocence. To her, everyone in this house was only a chess piece that could be sacrificed at any time. And Junie, for reasons no one understood, had fallen into her sights. One afternoon, Clarissa summoned the girl upstairs and pointed to a batch of luxury cosmetics from her own brand. Dozens of products supposedly preparing for launch, now scattered about with damaged packaging and several cracked bottles. "What have you done?" Clarissa hissed, her voice filled with false outrage. "This entire batch is worth more than a full year of your wages, and you've completely ruined it." Junie stood frozen, her face white, stammering that she had never touched that shipment, that she only worked in the kitchen and had never been assigned to organize any of those things. But Clarissa did not give her the slightest chance to explain. She declared that she had seen Junie herself, lingering near the shelves that morning, and that the girl would either repay the full damage, an enormous amount Junie could not have paid even if she worked her whole life, or pack her things and leave immediately with a stained record that would make it impossible for her to find work anywhere else. Junie tried to argue, tears streaming down her face, but the more she spoke, the more she realized she was falling into a trap that had already been set. A trap where truth had no place to stand. She ran from the room in tears, and it was not until late in the afternoon, when Nadia went down to the pantry to gather supplies for dinner, that she found Junie there, curled up among the dim shelves, arms wrapped around her knees, trembling and sobbing like a lost child. Nadia immediately knelt beside the girl, placed a hand on her shoulder, and in the gentlest voice she had, asked what had happened. Junie lifted her head with reddened eyes, and every word she told cut into Nadia's heart like a knife, because Nadia recognized the pattern at once, the accusation built with cruel precision, the threat wrapped in righteousness, the brutality hidden behind a flawless face. Through broken sobs, Junie said she didn't know what to do, that if she lost this job she wouldn't be able to stay in school, that the dream of becoming a designer she had carried for so many years was now falling apart because of one lie told by a woman she had never even done anything to offend. "What did I do wrong, Nadia?" the girl whispered. "I only wanted to study and work honestly." That question, innocent and aching, rang through the dark pantry like a bell striking the deepest place inside Nadia. She wrapped her arms around Junie and soothed the trembling girl. But inside her, something was rising in a rush, a smoldering anger she had held down for so many months, now beginning to boil. She had endured when Clarissa targeted her, had lowered her head when her dignity and even her hair were taken from her, had told herself that silence was the price she had to pay to protect Mila. But now, looking at this innocent 22-year-old girl collapsing beneath the weight of a crime she had never committed, Nadia realized that her silence was no longer only a shield for herself, but had become a curtain allowing evil to keep spreading. Every time she bowed her head, Clarissa became bolder, and this time, the one paying the price was not Nadia, but a young girl who had only just begun her life. Nadia tightened her hold on Junie's hand, and in the darkness of the pantry, she heard another question echo inside her own mind, a question she had avoided for far too long, asking how much longer she could remain silent. That question followed Nadia all the way back to the apartment that night, and when she sat alone by the window after Mila had fallen asleep, it refused to let her go, because it touched a wound she had buried for 10 long years. She sat there in the dark, lifting a hand to touch the faint scar on her left wrist, and like a door suddenly thrown open, the old memory rushed back with all its painful vividness. She saw herself again at 17, standing outside the garment workshop where her mother worked, the cramped workshop on the second floor of an old building where the woman had labored for years to raise her 2 daughters and keep them in school. She remembered the weeks before everything happened, when her mother came home with a tired face and small complaints that Nadia had not paid attention to then. Her mother had once told her that the workshop owner had locked one of the back doors so the workers couldn't sneak outside to rest, that the exit was now always bolted shut. Nadia had been too young then, and a vague uneasiness had flickered inside her when she heard those words. A feeling that something was wrong, that any workplace that gave people no way out was a dangerous place. But she had said nothing. She was only a child. Her mother was the adult. The owner was the one with power and money. And she had told herself that adult matters were not hers to worry about, that perhaps she was only overthinking things, that it was better to stay silent and not cause trouble. She had chosen silence. And then that fateful night came crashing down. The night the fire broke out in the garment workshop, and the door that should have saved lives refused to open. Her mother never came home. Nadia survived only because she had not been in the workshop that night. But from the moment she learned the news, she carried a weight heavier than loss itself. The haunting guilt that if she had dared to speak up, dared to voice the uneasy feeling inside her, dared to ask one question, dared to give one warning, perhaps everything might have been different. For 10 years, she had convinced herself that silence was the safest way to live, that lowering her head would help her avoid disaster. But now, sitting in the darkness with her hair taken from her and the image of Junie trembling in the pantry still branded into her mind, Nadia suddenly saw the bare truth she had avoided for far too long. Her silence at 17 had not saved her mother. It had protected no one. It had only left her to live the rest of her life with a question that would never have an answer. One endless what-if cutting into her heart forever. And now history was repeating itself right before her eyes. The same injustice. The same powerful person trampling the weak. The same silence being used as a shield to protect cruelty. If she kept lowering her head, if she chose silence again like the child she had once been, then the person who fell this time would be Junie. And after Junie there would be someone else, and then someone else again, until no one dared to stand up anymore. She had been silent once, and she had lost everything. She would not be silent again. In the darkness of the small room, something inside Nadia finally hardened into resolve, no longer the confused crack of the days before, but a clear and decisive choice, like steel tempered in fire. She didn't know how she would do it, didn't know what weight a maid's words could possibly carry against Clarissa's power and lies, didn't know whether she would have to pay with her job and with the fragile thread connecting Mila to hope. But she knew she could no longer keep living as a shadow with her head bowed. She looked out the window, where the night sky was slowly paling before the first rays of dawn, and for the first time in many years, what she felt was not fear, but the strange calm of someone who had just found her own voice again. But Clarissa, with the instincts of a predator, seemed to smell the change in Nadia before she could even act, and she decided to strike first, to break that will before it had a chance to grow. The next morning, just as Nadia stepped into the mansion with her heart full of resolve, she was immediately summoned into Clarissa's private office, where Clarissa sat behind a large desk with the terrifying calm of someone certain she had already won. On the desktop lay a folder of documents, and beside her stood a neatly dressed lawyer Nadia had never met before. "I'm afraid we have a serious problem," Clarissa said, her voice sweet and cold as she pushed the folder toward her. Inside were carefully staged pieces of evidence, forged messages, altered images, all of them suggesting that Nadia had secretly leaked formulas and trade secrets from Clarissa's cosmetics brand to one of her competitors. I trusted you. I allowed you to enter private rooms, and yet you betrayed me in the most disgraceful way, Clarissa said, each word falling like drops of acid. Nadia sat frozen, turning the pages with trembling hands, knowing clearly that everything inside was fabricated, but also understanding that it had been constructed with such precision that anyone looking at it would believe it. This is what I want, Clarissa continued, pushing another document in front of her, a confidentiality agreement that would force Nadia to sign and voluntarily resign within 48 hours. If you sign, everything will remain quiet. You leave silently, and no one needs to know about this evidence. But if you refuse to sign, she smiled, I'll release all of it, and you'll never find another job again. No decent family will dare hire a thief and a traitor. Nadia sat there, feeling the four walls closing in around her. She wanted to scream that all of it was a lie, wanted to run to Theodore, to the police, to anyone who might listen to her, but then brutal reality came down on her like a stone. She had nothing in her hands, not a single piece of proof to show her innocence, and she had no idea that in his small room, Mr. Oswald had been quietly recording every one of Clarissa's crimes over the past several weeks. She was only a maid, and what did the word of a maid mean when placed beside the word of a famous businesswoman admired by millions, an icon of elegance whom the whole world trusted? Who would believe her? The other servants in the house, even if they had witnessed certain things, were all too frightened of Clarissa for any of them to dare come forward, because they too had families to feed, jobs to keep, and fears of their own. And above all of that hung the greatest threat, the fragile thread connecting Mila to hope. If Nadia made trouble, if she resisted Clarissa, the woman who held the entire household budget in her hands, then the first thing to be cut would be the funding for her sister's treatment. Clarissa understood her trump card very well, and as if to prove that this power was real, she delivered the final blow. By the way, she said, her expression so casual it was cruel, I reviewed the household expenses and noticed a rather costly medical sponsorship for someone who isn't even part of this family's staff. I've had it temporarily suspended. Nadia felt the blood in her body turn to ice. She knew instantly what that meant. Mila's regular cochlear implant follow-up appointment, the important visit that had been scheduled for weeks, would be cancelled, and without that funding, her sister might lose the necessary care to preserve the gift of sound she had fought so hard to regain. It was not a physical threat, but something even crueler, a dry and cold tightening around the very lifeline Nadia had sacrificed everything to protect. She sat there, surrounded by lies, loneliness, and fear. And for the first time since finding her resolve again, she felt it waver beneath the weight of reality. Every door seemed to have closed in front of her. But in that most desperate moment, when every ordinary escape had been sealed shut, one name suddenly rang through her mind like the only remaining light in the darkness, the name of the only man who had ever bent down to her level, the man even Theodore owed a debt to, Dragan Kovacs. It took Nadia 2 days to gather enough courage to seek him out, 2 days in which she wrestled with her own fear, because going to a man whose name the whole city dared speak only in whispers was a dangerous thing. A maid like her should never even have dared to imagine. But she had no other choice left. Through a few careful questions and with small clues gathered from conversations she had once overheard by accident, she found her way to a quiet restaurant on the edge of the city, a place people said Dragan Kovac often visited. She stood in front of the door for a long time, both hands gripping her old purse tightly, her raggedly cut hair hidden beneath a scarf, and at last she stepped inside. The bodyguard recognized her almost immediately, the face his employer had once ordered him to remember, and after a brief hesitation, he led her to the table in the shadowed corner where Dragan was sitting alone. He looked up at her, his gray eyes showing no surprise, as if he had known this day would come. Nadia sat down across from him, and when she began to speak, her voice trembled but did not stop. She did not ask him for revenge, did not ask him to punish anyone, because she knew those things did not belong to her, and she did not dare dream of them. She only told the truth, the whole truth, about the months of being trampled down, about the tea set she had been falsely accused of breaking, about her hair being taken from her in the greenhouse, about innocent Junie being pushed to the edge, about the forged documents and the forced agreement, and finally, about her sister's follow-up appointment being coldly cut off. She said she had nowhere else to go, that all she was begging for was a job, any honest job, so she could continue supporting Mila and preserve that fragile thread of hope for her. "I know I have no right to come to you," she said, her eyes lowered to her hands. "I'm only a maid, and you're a powerful man. But you were the only person in that house who ever looked at me like a human being, so I risked coming here." Dragan did not interrupt her once. He sat silently through the entire story, his gray eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished speaking, a long silence fell over the table, heavy and deep. In that silence, something on the face of this weathered man changed, a rare emotion very few people had ever been allowed to see. "You don't know," Dragan finally said, his voice low and quiet, "that you have just told me a story I have lived with for more than 20 years. He paused, and for the first time, he allowed a piece of the past he had buried his whole life to rise into words. "I once had a younger sister," he said, and his steel-colored eyes seemed to dim for a moment. "When we were young and poor, my sister went to work as a maid in a wealthy family, just as you do now. And like you, she was trampled on, humiliated, treated as though she wasn't human. I promised I would protect her, but back then I was weak and had no power. I arrived too late. She was gone, and the people who caused it never paid the price, because they were rich and powerful. While my sister was only a maid, the world couldn't be bothered to see." He tightened his scarred hand on the tabletop. "Everything I built afterward, all this power, part of it came from the oath that I would never let myself be powerless again, and that I would never stand by while someone strong trampled someone weak with no one there to protect them. That is why I have one rule no one has ever dared to break." In that moment, the two people sitting across from each other, a powerful man with scars crisscrossing his hands, and a vulnerable woman with a faint scar on her wrist, suddenly understood that they were looking into the same wound, the same loss, the same silence that had once stolen the people they loved most. "You owe me nothing," Dragan said, his eyes returning to their familiar cold hardness. "But there are debts in this world that must be paid, and this debt, girl, does not belong to you. It belongs to me, and I have been waiting more than 20 years to collect it." From the moment Nadia left the restaurant that night, a quiet and precise machine began to move. But Dragan did not act in the way people so often whispered about him. He did not send anyone to threaten Clarissa, did not use force, did not do anything outside the law, because he understood that the strongest weapon against someone like her was not power, but the truth. And the truth, he realized, had already existed inside that mansion for a long time. It had only been hidden behind fear and buried beneath Clarissa's authority. His task was simply to draw it into the light, and his power was the force that made people who had never dared speak now find the courage to tell what they knew. The first person Dragan's men went to see was Junie. The 22-year-old girl was trembling and hesitant at first, because she still remembered all too clearly how Clarissa had threatened to destroy her future. But when she understood that there was now someone strong enough to protect her, that she no longer had to face that powerful woman alone, Junie agreed to tell the whole truth about the ruined cosmetics shipment she had been falsely accused of damaging, and the cruel pressure used against her. She did it not because anyone forced her, but because she chose to, because after long sleepless nights, she wanted to stand on the side of truth. But the most important witness, the person holding the key that could unlock the entire truth, was Mr. Oswald. When Dragan's people came to the old butler, he was not surprised at all, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He quietly opened his desk drawer and took out the old leather-covered notebook, the book in which, over the past several weeks, he had silently recorded every incident, every date, every word, every cruel act Clarissa had committed, from the tea set that had been smashed to the hair that had been taken, all of it written down in the neat, exact handwriting of a man who had worked carefully his whole life. But even that was not the most valuable thing. Oswald revealed that the mansion's security system, installed many years earlier with both video and audio recording devices in the shared living areas, had accidentally captured a priceless recording. During a moment when Clarissa was so triumphant she believed no one could hear her, she had let slip a boast about staging the entire ruined cosmetics shipment herself, not mainly to blame Junie, but as part of a larger scheme to report fake losses to the insurance company and gain a huge payout for her debt-ridden brand. That recording was the noose that could tighten around Clarissa's neck, and she, with the sharp instincts of someone always on guard, seemed to have sensed the danger. A few days earlier, she had begun suspecting the old butler, the man whose quiet eyes she had always felt could see through her, and she had ordered the technician to erase all data from the security system, under the excuse of upgrading the equipment. Had they been one day late, the most precious evidence might have vanished forever. But Oswald, with the caution of a man who had served the family for nearly 40 years and with the instinct that something needed to be preserved, had managed to back up the entire recording onto a separate device only a few hours before the deletion order was carried out. When he handed that backup to Dragon's people, his aged hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from relief, because the burden he had silently carried for so many weeks had finally found a place to be set down. Within only a few short days, from scattered fragments, a complete picture of the truth slowly emerged, sharp and impossible to deny. There was Oswald's meticulous journal, Junie's courageous testimony, records of the insurance fraud scheme, and above all, Clarissa's own voice condemning herself. Dragon reviewed everything with cold composure, and he understood that he now held something stronger than any threat. But he also understood that this truth was not for him to use in the way of darkness. It had to be placed exactly where it belonged, before the one person who had both the right and the duty to face it. The man who had been blindly trusting Clarissa's perfect mask all this time. The man who owed Dragon a debt of gratitude that was now about to come due. Theodore Hawthorne. Dragon chose to meet Theodore on a morning without warning, walking through the stone gate with his silent bodyguard behind him and a black leather briefcase in his hand. Theodore received him in the study with the cordial warmth of a man who owed him a debt. But that smile quickly faded when he noticed the unusually grave expression on his guest's face. "I'm not here because of business," Dragon said, placing the briefcase on the desk, "but because of a debt. You owe me a favor, Theodore, and today I'm going to collect it, though perhaps not in the way you expect. All I ask of you is to open this briefcase and face the truth you've been closing your eyes to for far too long." Theodore opened the briefcase with doubt in his expression, and what he saw inside made the color drain from his face minute by minute. There was Oswald's journal, filled with familiar handwriting that recorded each incident. There was Junie's written statement. There were records of the insurance fraud scheme. And finally, when Dragon's bodyguard played the recording, the entire room fell silent except for one voice. It was Clarissa's voice, cold and triumphant, boasting with her own mouth about the whole scheme she had staged. Theodore sank into his chair, his hands trembling, and in his eyes, Dragon saw an entire world collapsing. The world of a man finally realizing that the woman he loved was only a perfect mask, hiding a cruelty beyond words. Theodore summoned Clarissa down to the study, and he also called in the household staff, including Nadia, whom Dragon had brought back to the mansion that morning, standing quietly in one corner with the scarf still wrapped around her shorn hair. When Clarissa entered with her usual confident smile, she immediately sensed that something in the air was wrong, and that smile froze when her eyes met Dragan Kovac's ice-cold face and the open leather briefcase on the desk. "Explain this to me," Theodore said, his voice choked but steady, and he played the recording again. When her own voice rang through the room, accusing her of every crime she had thought perfectly hidden, Clarissa's face went through a frightening transformation. The elegant mask she had worked so hard to build began to crack, then shattered completely. Instead of weeping or denying guilt as she always had before, something inside her broke, and her cornered arrogance erupted into a rage she could no longer control. "So what?" she hissed, her voice warped and stripped of every trace of sweetness, her beautiful face now twisted with fury. "Yes, I did all of it, and I would do it again if I had to, because that's how this world works. People like that maid and that little kitchen girl were born to serve, to lower their heads, and if they dare forget their place, they deserve to be punished. Do you think you're so noble, Theodore? You're nothing but a weak, blind man, too foolish to see what was right in front of you." Each confession spilling from that frenzy was like another final nail she hammered into her own coffin, and everyone in the room stood frozen, witnessing Clarissa's true self finally exposed beneath the light. In desperation, she signaled to the private guard standing near the door, the man who had followed her to the mansion, and for one moment, the air in the room grew thick with tension as the large man stepped forward. But Dragon's bodyguard, who had been silently observing from the beginning, merely shifted slightly to one side and looked straight at him, a calm gaze carrying enough weight to make the other man understand that any foolish move would be a mistake beyond repair. Clarissa's guard stopped, hesitation flickering in his eyes, then slowly stepped back, because even a man paid to protect her was wise enough to realize that the balance of power in this room had completely shifted to one side. The confrontation dissolved in only a few seconds without a single act of violence, and that powerful silence made Clarissa's humiliating collapse stand out even more sharply. She stood there in the middle of the room, surrounded by the truth her own mouth had just spoken, with no lie left to cling to and no mask left to wear. And Nadia, standing silently in the corner, looked at the woman who had once terrified her, now laid bare by the truth, and felt not satisfaction, but something far quieter, the feeling of a person finally being cleared after long months buried in darkness. After Clarissa was taken out of the study and temporarily held in another room while the authorities were called, Dragon's bodyguard stepped closer to his employer and lowered his voice to say what perhaps anyone in their world would have thought. "Sir," he said, "a person like her will always look for a way to take revenge. She'll always be a danger later on. You only need to give the order, and we can settle this completely, so she'll never be able to hurt anyone again." Dragon remained silent for a long while, his gray eyes looking out the window where the morning sun was spreading gold across the garden. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but so decisive that it allowed no argument. "No," he said, "we won't do that." The bodyguard looked at him in surprise, because in all the years he had followed this man, he had rarely seen him refuse to remove such a clear threat. Dragon turned to look at him, and on that weathered face was a firmness that came from the deepest place in his soul. "If we do that," he said slowly, "then how are we any different from her? She tramples the weak because she believes power gives her the right to decide other people's fates, that the strong can do anything they want to the weak without paying the price. If I use my own strength now to deal with her in the shadows, then I'm speaking the same language she speaks, the language that killed my sister all those years ago. No, for some people, the most frightening punishment isn't disappearance, but being made to stand in the light and let the whole world see who they really are. Let the law do its work, and let shame do the rest. That is the punishment someone like her fears more than anything else." In that moment, standing silently in the corner and hearing every word, Nadia felt something break open inside her. Not pain, but a profound understanding of the true nature of strength. She had once thought power meant the ability to hurt others, that it meant control, that it meant forcing others to lower their heads, because that was all she had ever seen from Clarissa. But now, looking at the most powerful man on the East Coast, a man who could do anything he wanted with no one daring to stop him, choosing to restrain himself and place the truth in the hands of justice, she understood that real strength did not lie in what a person was capable of doing, but in what they chose not to do when they had every ability to do it. True strength was restraint, the ability to rise above cruelty without becoming another version of it, and the days that followed proved that Dragon had been right. The authorities stepped in, and the undeniable evidence quickly led to Clarissa being charged with a series of offenses, from conspiracy to commit insurance fraud to assault and coercion of servants. But the hardest blow against her did not come from the court. It came from the very world she had worshipped all her life. When the story broke, the recording and the details of her true self spread across social media at dizzying speed, and the very platform that had once praised her as an icon of elegance now turned its back on her without mercy. The brand of kind beauty, the name she had used to build an entire false empire, collapsed in only a few days. Partners withdrew one after another, and millions of people who had once admired her were now furious at the hypocrisy laid bare before them. The woman who had lived for the glow of fame was now burned alive by that very glow, and the shame Dragon had spoken of turned out to be the heaviest sentence of all, a sentence no prison cell could match. Clarissa Hawthorne Merrill, the woman who had believed beauty and power allowed her to stand above every other human being, was finally brought down not by violence, but by the very truth she had tried to bury. When the storm named Clarissa had passed, the Hawthorne mansion slowly found its breathing again. But it was no longer the same place, because what had just happened had changed everyone who lived within it, and the person who perhaps changed the most was Theodore himself. The first thing he did was completely clear Junie's name. He summoned the 22-year-old girl, personally apologized to her for everything she had been forced to endure, removed every baseless accusation that had once hung over her head, and not only kept her job for her, but also established a scholarship fund to help her finish the design program she had left unfinished, as a way to make amends for the fear she had carried. Junie burst into tears, but this time they were tears of relief. And when she found Nadia to thank the woman who had not abandoned her in that dark pantry, the two of them held each other. Two people who had once stood at the edge of the abyss now stepping back into the light together. But for Nadia, the thing that moved her most came one afternoon when Theodore called her into the study, the very room he had once allowed Clarissa to forbid her from entering. He stood when she stepped inside, a small gesture but one filled with meaning, because no employer had ever risen before a servant. "Nadia," he said, his voice thick with remorse, "I owe you an apology I don't know how to make fully enough. All this time, you were being trampled on under my own roof, stripped of both your dignity and the most sacred things that belonged to you. And yet I chose to close my eyes. I saw the signs. I sensed that something was wrong. But I chose to believe what was easier instead of the truth. Because facing the truth meant I would have to admit I had been wrong. I chose peace over justice. And that cowardice of mine made you and the others pay the price." Nadia stood silently and listened, and something inside her both ached and was soothed, because this was the first time in 7 years that someone in Theodore's position had admitted that she, too, was a human being worthy of respect. But Theodore did not stop at words, because he understood that apologies meant nothing if they were not accompanied by real change. He told her that he wanted her to become the new house manager of the mansion, succeeding Mr. Oswald when the old butler retired, not as a reward, but because he believed no one understood better than she did how a house should be run, so that no one ever had to live in fear again. And he wanted her to help him rebuild everything from the roots. Together, they would establish an entirely new process to protect the people who worked in the house, an anonymous reporting channel where anyone could speak up about injustice without fear of retaliation, an independent representative to defend workers' rights, and regular meetings to listen to the voice of every person in the household, even the least powerful among them. Nadia listened, and she did not hurry to accept at once. Instead, she looked directly into Theodore's eyes, and with a calm she had never before dared to possess, she said she would take on this responsibility only if those changes were real and lasting, not merely a way to soothe his conscience for a little while. She said she had witnessed too much to believe in easy promises, that a house was not measured by its luxury, but by how it treated the most vulnerable people living inside it. Theodore nodded, and in his eyes, Nadia saw not the condescension of a master granting favor, but the sincere respect of a man who had finally understood the true worth of the person standing before him. That day, the woman who had once been an invisible shadow quietly cleaning the hallways of this house walked out of the study with her head no longer bowed, but held high, not because she had gained a position, but because she had reclaimed the most precious thing people had once tried to take from her, her own dignity. But there was still one more wound in Nadia's life that had not been healed, a wound older than anything Clarissa had caused, and Dragan was the one who did not forget it. On the night Nadia sat across from him in the restaurant and poured out the whole story of her life, she had unintentionally mentioned the garment workshop fire from years before, the mother who had vanished in smoke and flame, the emergency exit that should have saved lives but had been locked tight instead. At the time, she had spoken of it only as part of the pain that had shaped who she was, expecting nothing from it, but Dragan had listened and remembered every detail, because to a man who carried the torment of a loved one who had never received justice, no injustice was too small to ignore. Quietly, without making Nadia a single promise, he set his network to retrace a case that time and power had buried for 10 years. What they uncovered slowly revealed a truth the victims' families had never known. The old records showed that the fire had been investigated carelessly and then closed quickly, ruled an unfortunate accident, with no one held responsible. But behind that rushed conclusion was a truth that had been hidden. The garment workshop owner, to save money and control his workers, had ordered the rear emergency exit locked, turning it into a death trap on that fateful night. And when disaster struck, instead of facing the consequences, he used money to silence those who could testify, bribed those responsible for the investigation, and made the whole truth about the locked door disappear from the official records. For 10 years, the families who had lost loved ones had lived believing it was only an unavoidable accident, never knowing that their loved ones might have survived if not for one man's greed and cruelty. When Dragan had those pieces of evidence in his hands, once again he did not choose the path of darkness. He did not go after the workshop owner for revenge, though he absolutely could have. Instead, he handed the entire file to an upright lawyer, famous for never backing down before power or money, someone he trusted to pursue justice to the end. The case from years before was reopened, and this time, under the light of new evidence and the persistence of a legal machine that could not be bought, The truth was finally exposed. The workshop owner had to face the law for what he had done and concealed, and the victims' families, after 10 long years of living in the darkness of misunderstanding, finally received the acknowledgement and compensation they deserved. When Nadia heard the news, she stood motionless for a long time, and then the tears she had held back for 10 years simply rolled down her cheeks. These were not tears of pain, but of deep release, because at last, after all those years of carrying the guilt that if only she had spoken up, she realized an important truth. Her mother's death had never been her fault. Not the fault of a 17-year-old girl with a vague, uneasy feeling. It was the fault of a man who had chosen greed over human life, and of a system that had chosen silence over truth. For years, she had punished herself for a sin that had never belonged to her. And now, as justice finally found its way to the light, the invisible chain that had bound her heart for a full decade was at last undone. She visited her mother's grave on a windy afternoon, placed a bundle of rosemary there, the plant that carried the scent of the hair her mother had once washed for her, and she sat there for a very long time, quietly telling her mother that the truth had finally been brought to light, that the people who caused this had paid the price, that her mother could rest now. For the first time since that terrible night, Nadia felt she could take one deep breath without being strangled by remorse, and she understood that speaking up, no matter how late it came, still had the power to mend what silence had broken. 6 months later, on a spring morning when golden sunlight spread across the little street, a new door opened in a modest neighborhood where many immigrant working families lived. It was not a magnificent building like the Hawthorne mansion, only a humble house renovated with part of the compensation Nadia had received. But to her, it was more precious than any luxurious estate, because it carried a sacred name. On the sign hanging in front of the door was the name of her mother, the woman who had vanished into smoke and fire years ago, and beneath it was a simple line explaining that this was a small foundation offering free vocational training and sign language classes for the children of poor workers. For children and people the world often treated as invisible, Nadia had poured into this place everything she had once longed for when she was still a girl with her head bowed, cleaning cold hallways in silence, a place where anyone who stepped inside would be seen as a whole human being, given the opportunity and dignity she herself had fought so long to reclaim. Mila stood beside her sister on opening day, her face radiant with pure happiness, because now she was no longer only a girl learning to bake, but would become one of the first instructors, teaching sign language to children who were like she had once been, so that no one would have to grow up inside the loneliness of being unable to connect with the world around them. And then, amid the small crowd gathered in front of the door, a familiar car quietly stopped, and Dragan Kovac stepped out. He came without display, without a grand entourage, simply a man in a dark suit who had come to witness something good being born from the very truth he had helped bring into the light. Nadia stepped forward to greet him, and between them was a deep understanding that needed no words. The understanding of two people who had carried similar scars and had together turned pain into something meaningful. Mila moved closer to the man who had silently changed both sisters' lives, and with her hands, she slowly signed the words, "Thank you," her eyes shining with sincere gratitude. Dragan looked at her for a moment, and then something happened that surprised both Nadia and Mila. That powerful man with the scarred hands, a man who had never studied this language before, awkwardly lifted his hands and tried to sign a reply, the movements clumsy and imperfect, yet filled with such sincerity that Mila burst into laughter, and Nadia's eyes filled with tears. In that small moment, there was no power, no status, no distance between wealth and poverty. Only three human beings connected by the most universal language of all: respect and kindness. The story of Nadia Voskin ends there, not with a fairy tale wedding or a perfect ending, but with something even more beautiful. A person who had been trampled to the very bottom standing up, reclaiming her dignity, and then using what she had learned to light hope for others. And if there is one lesson that remains from this story, it is that a person's dignity has never been decided by the work they do, by the money they have, or by the position they hold in the eyes of the world, but by the respect each of us deserves to receive and deserves to offer one another. Silence in the face of evil has never been safety. It is only a curtain that allows injustice to keep spreading. And sometimes, the courage of one small person to raise her voice can change things that once seemed impossible to change. True strength does not lie in the ability to hurt others, but in restraint, in compassion, and in choosing what is right, even when we are fully capable of doing the opposite. Hair will grow back, but dignity, once we have reclaimed it, will never again be something we allow anyone to cut away. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so you can listen to many more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about Nadia's story. What part of her journey moved you the most? So please don't hesitate to leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because every word you write is a precious source of encouragement for us to continue bringing you stories that touch the soul. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. I wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.